Thank you so much, Ruz, for the kind introduction. And it's my privilege to be able to talk with you today based on my 20 years of experience of caring for people with significant burn injuries. And I'm going to really focus on, the consequences and the constellation of issues that burn survivors face for those who do survive these serious injuries. Next slide, please. So burns are really an ancient and horrific injury. They were first documented, that we know, about 3,500 years ago in a document called Eber's Papyrus, where they describe the treatment of burns. And even in the 1800s, a well-known physician, Dr. Bigelow, described burns as the distressful effects of these burn injuries are exceeded by few other diseases. And a recent physician made this statement that nowhere in surgery is the patient's life at risk from so many disorders of function for so long, and surely nowhere are pain and physical and emotional suffering any greater. Next slide, please. I want to talk with you about these constellation of symptoms and really issues that burn survivors face, and really to describe that these issues go much further than just issues related to the skin, and really they affect every part of the body system. And recently, clinicians and researchers have begun to describe burns as a chronic condition, and that it affects people for the rest of their lives. It completely changes the trajectory of their lives after their injury. Next slide, please. I'm going to walk you through a handful of these major issues that they face, and this is really just scratching the surface, but just to give you a picture of the various issues a burn survivor has to deal with for the rest of their life. Contractures are the inability to move a joint through its complete range of motion. This occurs after a burn with the skin and the soft tissue and other tissues that contract after an injury. Many patients after leaving the hospital are faced with this for the rest of their lives, and has significant impact on their function. Next slide. When you think about one joint, just the elbow, just to give a simple example, people who cannot use their elbow fully have all sorts of things they can't do. And from the very top of the slide, combing one's hair, eating with a fork, washing one's face, turning a knob of a door. I mean, just basic activities and daily care for oneself are things that can be affected and unable for them to do. Next slide, please. Scarring is really significant. There's this form of hypertrophic scarring where the skin becomes raised and red and thick. It can lead to problems with moving of joints, changes in appearance. These are some examples of scarring, and this is something can last a lifetime as well, affecting people's sense of body image and also the function of their skin and their joints. Next slide, please. People who have burns that are deeper when it's really a hot, the temperature is so hot and the flame persists for so long, it goes to tissue below the skin, to the soft tissue, and to bone, which can create non-viable tissue and necessitate an amputation of that limb. People who then suffer amputations related to their burns have all sorts of other problems related to the amputation, with problems with their bones and muscle joints, sensation, and other skin-related issues near the area where they had the amputation. Obviously, an amputation can affect the way you move and things you do in very significant ways for the rest of your life. Next slide. Lots of symptoms persist, and people probably are very familiar with this idea that pain is a universal and very severe symptom that burn survivors experience. They experience it, for persistent periods acutely, and then often chronically. Nerve-like pain is chronic for many patients. Itch, also called pruritus as a medical term, sounds like a minor symptom, but there was a recent study that looked at people 17 years after injury, and over 70% of them were still reporting itch, which can affect people's sleep and quality of life in significant ways. And then neuropathy, where the burns actually impact the nerves of their body, in which can affect their way their muscles work and their sensation, so they can't feel things correctly, are long-lasting symptoms as well in a minority of burn survivors. Next slide. People don't always think about this, but one of the main purposes of skin is to help you regulate your body temperature. And when you have sweat glands beneath your skin, which help regulate your temperature. And when you have a large burn that goes through the entire layer of the skin, you don't replace the sweat glands of that skin. So people who have very large burn injuries effectively have difficulties with regulating their own body temperature. This can affect everything from, exercise tolerance, just getting out into the world on a sunny day and a hot day, to people being able to get back to going to work and school and things like that. Next slide. The body's reaction to a very severe burn causes what's called a hypermetabolic state. This is when the body sort of ramps up in order to fight off the burn. But the problem is that this state of hypermetabolism continues often for over a year into the future, and can affect people's ability to heal their wounds, risk of infection, affect their ability to keep weight and be a healthy weight, and ultimately affect their function and community participation as well. Next slide. One of the other sort of lesser known problems is that people can have cognitive impairments related to their injury. When there's a large flame injury and burns, they often don't get adequate oxygenation during the time of the fire. They can also go into a state of shock while they're out in the field, and with prolonged time to resuscitate them, leading to lack of blood perfusion to the brain. These have been documented with people having problems with very simple cognitive tasks like basic memory, problem solving, ability to concentrate. In a study that our group did, about 80% of people who left the hospital who needed needed inpatient rehabilitation had cognitive deficits when they left the hospital. And still, when those people eventually went home, over a quarter of them were still experiencing cognitive problems. Next slide, please. And the other panelists spoke about sort of the psychosocial issues, and I think that these can't be underestimated. Issues that the injury completely changes the trajectory of one's life, and redefining the kind of life they will have, and the issues they'll face, and how they have to manage them. Issues like post-traumatic stress and depression are extremely common, and up to almost half the people who survive a burn injury. There are various issues with body image, self-esteem, stigma, community integration, social interactions and relationships, how people engage with their family and friends, and even with strangers. In certain parts of the world, the cultural layers and how people are accepted with different visual differences are often a major challenge to people, not only getting out into public and interacting with public, but also in their own families. Quality of life, sleep, or some other issues. Next slide. Lastly, I just want to end by talking about employment. I mean, and it's also true for school issues, but there was some study done here in the States a number of years ago showing that people spend at least a couple of months off for work after an injury, and that many people took up to 24 months to get back to work. However, when they drilled down the data to look in more detail, they found that really only a little more than a third of people were able to eventually get back to their same job with their same employer without any accommodations for the work, which really underlines the amount of disruption it caused in their lives, and that most people weren't able to go back and do what they did before. And I think these issues are mirrored in children and their ability to return to school in the same way they did prior. Next slide. So I just wanted to end by thanking you for the opportunity to talk to you today, and just in reflecting on my own experience, having cared for hundreds of burn survivors over the past 20 years. Any efforts we can make to reduce the impact of burns in war zones, and unnecessary suffering and lifelong disruption for innocent people is a cause worth fighting for. Thank you very much.